This week, one of the big issues that we've been discussing on the program is the new bill to amend the euthanasia legislation here in New Zealand. And when the actual bill was discussed a few years back, some people said, well, hey, we may start here, but that's a slippery slope for where we may end up. And one of the parts of the world which was held up as a cautionary tale of, hey, we don't want to end up like these guys, is Canada. Joining me on the program from Canada, she is the founder of the Dying to Meet You project, Amanda Achtman. Kia ora, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
It's a bit of a worry, isn't it, when your country of origin is held up as a cautionary tale to the rest of the world, but that very much is the case for Canada and the euthanasia legislation that you have at the moment. First up, describe for us what that legislation is and what some of the impact that you're seeing is.
Sure. In 2016, Canada legalized euthanasia nationwide, and this was in response to a Supreme Court ruling that then passed the responsibility to Parliament to devise a law in conformity with that Supreme Court case. So that's a bit different to the referendum means by which euthanasia was brought in here in New Zealand. And so Parliament made a law that was intended to be sufficiently restrictive to those whose deaths were deemed reasonably foreseeable and who had a grievous and irremediable condition. And so it was seen to be within this end-of-life terminal context that euthanasia was initially brought in. However, there were not very definite parameters. Those were rather subjective measures, and it did not take long before the rationale was that other people who are not terminally ill could be suffering just as much or have other kind of pain throughout their lives. And so in 2021, euthanasia was expanded on the basis of disability and mental illness. That law passed in March 2021. Immediately, people with disabilities became eligible or began to qualify. And I say those words with hesitation, really, because what kind of eligibility is that? And the mental illness as a sole condition criterion has been staved off and bumped year after year, with the government admitting that we're not ready. Truth be told, we will never be ready to end the lives of people with mental illness as a sole condition. So euthanasia has become really routine in Canada. What started out as exceptional and something that happens in extenuating circumstances, now euthanasia accounts for 1 in 20 deaths.
Wow.
And many people see euthanasia not as a last resort, but actually as the ideal form of dying. That's what's changed, and that's what I want to put forward. This is not about simply one policy change among several. This is fundamentally a cultural shift that changes everything.
That's I suppose the question that I wanted to ask you, because the legislation can do so much. It can certainly point in a different direction. But that huge cultural change, the way in which Canadian people see their relationship with death, the way in which they see end of life as something you can opt into in the same way that you might get Uber Eats, that the way in which society's relationship with death, that has changed, and within a relatively short period of time.
What I would really wish to stress is that while euthanasia is normally put forward as a means to relieve physical pain and suffering, what Canada does do, thankfully, quite well, and what I would very much encourage other jurisdictions to push for, is capturing data on the real reasons why people are seeking euthanasia. Wouldn't it be reasonable to survey people who are opting for it about their motivations? And so Canada does keep this data, each year publishing an annual report. And the number one kind of suffering, by people's own admission who are going through with it, that leads to the request is not actually pain or even the fear of pain, which are put in the same category.
Yeah.
It's not feeling like a burden or financial. Those are all on the list, to be sure. But the number one kind of suffering is inability to engage in meaningful life activities. That's number one. And the second biggest reason is the inability to perform the daily activities of personal care. So people are saying, once I can no longer go to the washroom by myself, I would like to end it. Or if I can no longer play bridge, or if I can no longer travel in the winters. These are real existential frustrations that creep in that help antagonize a person's sense of their own value and their own purpose in life. And that's what makes these issues so interesting to me, that the fact they are related to meaning. And I've always been very sensitive to these questions of what is the meaning of life? Do we have a meaning in the face of suffering and death? That's what really brings me to this public debate.
That is such an eye-opener, really, that for a lot of people, uh, loneliness and not being able to do the things that they used to do, that's why for them their life is over. And of course, the euthanasia legislation says, okay, well, you're happy to take that option. And I suppose society's response to go, well, that solves that problem then, rather than saying, how do we tackle the problem of loneliness, particularly in older people or disabled people within our communities? How do we provide support for those who perhaps don't have the mobility and capacity that they used to have? In some ways, for the government, for society, for the health system, euthanasia solves those problems. They don't have to solve them anymore.
And we make a big deal out of this supposedly being a voluntary and free choice. But what I like to stress is if what someone is asking for is to be killed, to have their life ended prematurely, is that not a red flag
Yeah,
about the freedom or about the voluntariness of this? And what we really see now is a two-track society where some people get suicide assistance and other people get suicide prevention.
yeah.
I hear from about fellow Canadians who are so distraught. They tell me, especially my friends with disabilities, that MAID, medical aid in dying, as we call it, is the only thing I qualify for. It's the only thing the government is telling me I'm eligible for. And so Canadians have become scandalized and horrified that a veteran would be offered by a Veterans Affairs bureaucrat euthanasia rather than PTSD support,
Mm.
or that a woman in a wheelchair would be counseled to consider euthanasia rather than getting a ramp installed in her home. This represents a declaration of defeat, not of freedom and autonomy.
You mentioned there the fact that in Canada, medical professionals can offer this service. This is one of the proposed changes, of course, which has come up this week with the private members bill. That at the moment this can't be put forward by a medical professional as a suggestion. Talk to us about the difference that that's made in Canadian society. The fact that this is something that can be hawked or peddled by medical professionals as just another medical service and something that they can recommend as a course of so-called treatment for the condition somebody is facing.
Yes, two things massively increase people's propensity to request euthanasia. And one is the fact that the doctor or nurse does it directly. The distinction being, for example, in the United States, the states that have it only have assisted suicide, where you have to take the lethal substance yourself. In Canada, we have both the option for self-administration of the lethal substance or a doctor or nurse. But more than 99% of cases involve the doctor or nurse doing it. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
And I point that out in response to your question because it's the moral authority of the doctor to which people look. People who would say that this is all about autonomy betray that they actually don't want it to be purely autonomous, because when you think about it, suicide, simply put, is more autonomous. This is about involving a medical practitioner within a public health system to be employed to end the life of citizens. So that's the first point I want to make. And
Yeah.
now the suggestion, when a doctor or nurse who naturally wields a kind of authority and expertise over his or her patient, a patient is literally a sufferer and is in a position of some vulnerability. And so it's a trusting kind of relationship. Well, I think that the fact of raising euthanasia as a suggestion from someone in authority already kills the person.
Yeah.
It already deflates and defeats your sense of self. There was a woman in Canada who was going to have a mastectomy, and just before undergoing this surgery, she was told, well, have you heard of medical assistance in dying? How do you submit yourself to such a vulnerable surgery and entrust yourself into the hands of these people for the next hours after having that thought planted? And how dark that just before going under for the surgery,
Yeah.
those would be the last things. We have to think about the psychological toll that having euthanasia on offer presents. Some people would say, don't want it, don't have it, but it has this sinister effect that really corrodes the entire profession.
And the trust that people have in the medical profession as well. Certainly here in New Zealand, it is the situation where for most medical professionals, they don't want to have a bar of it. This is a problem that euthanasia has in New Zealand. And again, inverted commas on this, that there's not enough health professionals that are willing to participate or recommend in this, that the demand outstrips supply. Have you seen that change over time in Canada? Has there been more of a move towards support for assisted dying from the medical community than there was initially?
Absolutely. Since legalization, it has become more and more accepted, including by practitioners who would have 10 years ago considered it antithetical to the profession. In a memoir, a Canadian euthanasia doctor actually takes up the question of the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah.
And she says that I didn't see assisted dying so much as harming as I saw it as a help. The underlying illness was killing the person, and I was simply helping along the enactment of their wishes. So any principle can be inverted and distorted
Yeah.
to kind of rationalize it, but the legal sanction that has been given to this by the government has had a really detrimental effect on the consciences of practitioners who are now given this exemption to the criminal code offense of homicide. That's how it was legalized, was creating this exception to homicide so that doctors and nurses are not culpable so long as they're following the particular criteria. And it used to be that doctors were nervous about raising euthanasia unsolicited with their patients, lest they be deemed counseling them to suicide. Now that has flipped, and I hear from doctors and residents who say that they are more concerned that if they do not present it as among the available so-called treatment options, they could face reprimand by the professional colleges. So that is a massive change.
There are some people who are very concerned that there's an aspect of inevitability towards this, that now that New Zealand has started down this path, that we will be in a few years where Canada is at the moment. How would you respond to that? Is there an inevitability about this process once started, difficult to turn around, or is there some hope in this space?
Well, I'll say there isn't an inevitability insofar as I'm not a fatalist or a determinist, and I think that you can turn things around when you see them rightly. On the other hand, the point I would wish to make is that the euthanasia mentality, if followed to its conclusions, demands that expansion. Why? Because if euthanasia is seen as a reasonable, compassionate means to alleviate suffering, why wouldn't you make it available to more and more people? It becomes cruel. And so everything comes down to whether euthanasia is a good thing or a bad thing. And if it's a good thing, then everyone should have it. And if it's a bad thing, then no one should have it. But in this matter of life or death, you cannot really have just a little bit of euthanasia and not have it have this ripple effect and contagion effect also with suicide throughout the society. So it can be turned around, but it takes a fundamental recognition that it is dehumanizing to discard, dismiss, and discount people on the basis of illness, disability, whatever condition they may have. Everyone deserves so much better. And that would be my main encouragement to people here. Cast your aspirations higher. Don't settle. You deserve way better than premature death.
And hey, I suppose some people are saying, oh, well, there's a choice in this. And here in New Zealand it was couched in the language of end of life choices, and yet we don't have the access to palliative care. So it's a bit of a false choice in that regard. But from what you're saying, it may start as a choice, but as the culture shifts and as legislation moves in that direction, it goes from a choice to more of a compulsion, more societal pressure.
And it's important too, as a study that was produced here is titled Interrogating Choices. Let's
Mm.
scrutinize the choices that people are making. In Canada, I read the obituaries of people who are dying by euthanasia. Why? Because I have a Google alert on MAID, medical aid in dying, and almost every day I get a new Google alert with an obituary mentioning a death by euthanasia. So I go and I read, and by being curious about people's lives who are opting for this, I realize first and foremost that they maybe have a lack of family and friends when they spend more time naming the members of the euthanasia team than naming any friends and family in the obituary. If that's not a choice worth interrogating, or for example, it's clear that someone is bereaved and that, yes, they may have cancer. Yes, indeed, they may be nearing the end of their natural life, but the real motivation is clearly the sadness over having lost their spouse.
Yeah.
And so, what do we say to someone who is so bereaved that they consider euthanasia a means of hastening their reunion with the spouse who they lost? These are the deep psychosocial and existential dimensions to which justice requires that we attend in order to do due diligence to those in our society who are really making what is plainly a cry for help.
Very much appreciate the perspective that you bring, the truth that you tell, and hey, maybe for us here in New Zealand, it's not too late. I know some good people advocating in the opposite direction of the entropy and the flow that things seem to be heading in at the moment. But hey, very much appreciate your thoughts and comments on this, Amanda. Thanks very much for being on the program.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.